The first shock was not the cold, but the sound. A thin, high whistle, like a blade drawn across glass, sliced through the heavy silence of the frozen gulf. It was the wind scouring ice that had known no thaw for months. Ice that was not a surface but a geography of pain, pressure ridges like fractured bones, dark leads of open water breathing out death fog, snowfields glittering with hidden malice. Through a pair of captured German binoculars, their optics frozen at the edges, Captain First Rank Gorshkov tracked the source of the sound. Not the wind, the island. A jagged black molar rising from the jawbone of the sea. Fort Mullet. Hammer. In the failing afternoon light, it was a stain, a brutalist error against the white vastness. He could see the geometric scars of reinforced concrete, the faint metallic glint of a rotating cupola. It did not look like a fortress. It looked like a factory that produced corpses. His knuckles, gripping the binoculars, were white, the skin taut and shiny with old frostbite. The cold was a living entity here, seeping through the thickest felt boots, the heaviest sheepskin, to settle in the marrow. It was the true enemy, and it was already winning. Then movement. A tiny dark speck, a fleck of grit against the colossal white, inched its way from the island's eastern rock face onto the ice. One of his men. Scout Party Gamma, sent out 36 hours ago. A 3-man team. Only one was returning. The man was crawling, not with stealth, but with the desperate, broken rhythm of a crippled insect. A snail's trail of something darker than snow smeared behind him. Gorshkov's breath halted, crystallizing in his lungs. From the fortress, a lazy, almost casual spark flickered at a lower embrasure. A full second later, the dry, stitching cough of a MG-34 reached them, the sound flattened and dissipated by the distance. On the ice, puffs of snow erupted around the crawling figure in a neat, walking line. The figure jerked once, a final spastic motion, and then became still. Another dark stain bloomed around it, slowly, like ink on blotting paper. The wind's whistle reclaimed the silence. It was a dismissal. Gorshkov lowered the binoculars. His face, a topography of scars and weathered trenches, did not twitch. But something behind his eyes, something animal and furious, went dark and cold. He turned from the vista of failure. Behind him, in a hollow scraped by shovels and despair, waited what was left of his naval infantry battalion. They were specters in ragged uniforms, their faces hollowed by the siege, their eyes holding the flat, mineral sheen of men who had seen the arithmetic of survival and found the sum wanting. They had witnessed the death on the ice. No one spoke. The message was clearer than any communique. The ice was a killing floor. The fortress was watching. Among them, one man did not look at the distant corpse. He sat on an overturned ammunition crate, methodically rubbing a lump of coarse grease into the leather of his boot. His movements were economical, ritualistic. Senior Sergeant Boris Kotov, Batya, the old man. A network of scars, the most prominent a savage, pale furrow from left temple to jaw, gave his face a permanent look of skewed judgment. He was not old, but he carried a density of silence that made the younger men seem like ghosts. Gorshkov approached. He did not hold out the flimsy operation order. He simply spoke, his voice the grind of gravel on steel. The key is in the lock. The lock is Mollet. The door must be opened by 0430. The big push hinges on our silence. If we are loud, the ice will tell them everything. Kotov finished with his boot. He looked up, not at Gorshkov, but through him, at the memory of a different fortress, a different sea. For a fraction of a second, his pupils dilated. The grease-stiffened leather of his glove creaked as his fist clenched. A different darkness, not of snow but of wet-sucking stone. The roar of water in a confined pipe, a scream cut short into a gurgle. The face of a boy, not a soldier, a boy from his village, pressed against rusted iron grating, eyes wide with terror, just before the current took him forever. The smell of salt and sewage and iron. He blinked. The memory receded, leaving a colder void behind his eyes. The fortress on the horizon was no longer just an objective. It was a recursion of his deepest failure, a debt inscribed in concrete. He stood. The movement was not fast, but it had the finality of a tectonic shift. He did not ask for volunteers. He turned his skewed gaze on a specific cluster of men. Markov, the Siberian, whose face was all angles and patience, a trapper who could read stories in disturbed snow. Yevgeny, once a stoker on the Marat, his frame a monument of solid muscle, hands like blackened vices. And Sasha, the student, his wire-mended glasses, reflecting a world he was desperately trying to parse into equations that would not end in death. A single, curt nod. The selection was made. Now came the transformation. From heavy tarpaulin bags, they drew out their bushlats. The black wool was not new. It was matted, stiff with frozen salt spray, engine grease, and the indelible rusty patina of old blood. These were not issued. They were inherited. Talismans, uniforms of a sect. As each man shrugged the immense coat onto his shoulders, a profound change occurred. Their individual forms, the stoop of the tired, the nervous hunch of the young, were erased. They became monolithic, impersonal, a collective shadow. The black absorbed the feeble light, promising nothing but void. The legend was palpable now. Schwarzer Tod. The Black Death was not a poetic metaphor. It was a statement of intent, woven into the very fibers. Kotov moved among his black-clad brothers. His inspection was intimate, invasive. He checked knife edges against his thumb, tested the tension of grenade pins, redistributed ammunition belts with brutal efficiency. He stopped before Sasha, who was fumbling with the bulky bolt cutters. Kotov's scarred hands, surprisingly deft, took the tool, adjusted the grip on the boy's shoulder strap, and slid a whetstone from his own pocket into Sasha's frozen fingers. "You do not look at the fortress." Kotov's voice was a low rumble, barely audible. "You look at the ice before your feet. You look for the lines, the cracks, the lies. You see for all of us." He then turned to the group, his silhouette a black cutout against the relentless white. He raised a clenched fist, not in rally, but as a demonstration of a tool. The black leather of his glove strained. "We are not soldiers storming a gate. We are a poison. We are the rust in the joint, the crack in the foundation. We seep in. We do not break. We corrupt." From Gorshkov, he received only 2 items: a hand-drawn schematic on tissue paper, showing the bowels of the fort, the sewage pipe highlighted in shaky blue pencil, a birth canal into hell, and a small unmarked tin. Kotov pried it open. Inside was a thick, vile-smelling paste of grease and soot. Without a word, he dipped his fingers in and began smearing the substance across his face, blackening the pale scars, erasing his humanity feature by feature. The men followed suit. The transformation was complete. They were no longer men. They were instruments of a single dark purpose. The final act was not a speech. It was an exhalation. The 24 black forms turned as one and flowed over the lip of the hollow onto the open ice. They did not march. They seeped forward, low, their forms blurring, breaking up, exploiting every ripple and shadow on the frozen plain. They became a spreading stain, a living shadow detaching from the land, slinking toward the monolith that had just murdered one of their own. On the shore, Gorshkov watched them dissolve into the twilight. The only sound was the eternal cutting whistle of the wind over the ice, and the deafening echo of the single, unanswered shot that had begun it all. The lock was waiting. The poison was in motion. The ice was not a flat, white road. It was a kingdom of deceit. Every crunch of a boot, every scrape of a sled runner, felt like a scream in the cathedral silence. The cold was no longer an atmosphere. It was a physical weight, pressing the black-clad figures down, trying to fuse them to the frozen sea. They moved not as a column, but as a constellation of shadows, each man 10 paces from the next, a ghostly dispersal meant to confound any watching machine gun sight. Senior Sergeant Kotov, Batya, was the point of the spear. He did not walk. He flowed, his body a low, liquid silhouette against the achingly bright snow. His eyes, narrowed to slits against the glare, scanned not the distant fortress, but the ice itself. He read it like the Siberian, Markov, read animal tracks. He saw the faint, treacherous depression of a snow-covered lead. Water, thinly veiled by a skin of new ice, ready to swallow a man into a black, sub-zero grave. He saw the pressure ridge ahead not as an obstacle, but as a smokescreen of shattered blue-white blocks. He raised a clenched fist, a black punctuation mark in the void. The constellation halted, froze, became part of the landscape. Behind him, Yevgeny, the stoker, pulled the lightweight aluminum sled. It carried not just extra ammunition and explosives, but the soul-crushing reality of their mission. Satchel charges, bundled grenades, a flamethrower whose fuel tanks wept icy condensation. The sled runners whined a secret song of protest against the snow. Each whine made Sasha, the student, flinch. He walked behind Yevgeny, his world reduced to the circle of ice illuminated by his straining, fearful perception. He saw geometric patterns in the frost, fractal branches of cold that seemed to point accusingly towards the fortress. He saw the trail of the dying scout, now just a vague discoloration marring the perfect white, a road mark to hell. His breath came in ragged, steaming gasps, fogging his wired glasses, and each time he wiped them clean, the fortress seemed to have grown larger, closer, its shadows deeper. Kotov led them into the lee of the first major pressure ridge. The ice here was sculpted into a cavern of sorts, walls of opaque blue-tinted ice that swallowed sound. For a moment, the relentless wind was muted. The silence here was even more profound, a ringing vacuum in the ears. It was in this false sanctuary that Kotov stopped them. He pointed a black-gloved finger at the ice under their feet. There, preserved in the frozen surface like insects in amber, were footprints. Not theirs. Not Soviet felt boots with their distinctive diamond pattern. These were the deeper, broader impressions of German winter boots, the tread clear and sharp. A patrol. Recent. The ice did not lie. It recorded every sin. Kotov did not need to signal. Markov, the hunter, was already beside him, on one knee. His face, smeared with soot grease, was impassive. He pointed east, then held up 2 fingers, then traced a slow arc. 2 men had passed through this defile, moving on a predictable, sweeping route. Clockwork. The routine of an army that believed itself secure. The decision was not a decision. It was an inevitability. They could not leave witnesses at their back. They could not risk an alarm sounded from the ice. Kotov's eyes found Yevgeny's, then Markov's. A look passed between them. A decade of shared violence communicated in a blink. Kotov pointed to Markov, then to the eastern end of the ice cavern. He pointed to Yevgeny, then to the western approach. They were to be the anvil and the hammer. He then looked at Sasha, and with a slow, deliberate gesture, pointed to the student's eyes, then to the highest point on the ridge above them. Sasha's job? Watch. Bear witness. The two black forms melted into the jagged icescape. Yevgeny became a shadow against a shadow. Markov simply ceased to exist where he had knelt. The wait was an eternity compressed into minutes. Sasha, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, peered over the ridge. The vast white emptiness yawned before him. Then, movement. Two gray-green smudges against the white, moving with the bored, trudging gait of men performing a duty they believed meaningless. They were closer than Sasha had feared. He could see the steam of their breath, the rifle slung over one man's shoulder, the other lighting a cigarette, cupping his hands against the wind. The mundane act of it, the sheer normalcy, sent a wave of nausea through him. From the east, a whisper of sound, a dislodged icicle tinkling as it fell. The smoking German paused, frowned, turning his head. It was the only warning. A black shape erupted from a fissure in the ice to the west. Yevgeny. He did not roar. He was a force of nature, a tidal wave of silent muscle. His arm locked around the nearest German's neck from behind, with a sound like a snapping branch. The cigarette tumbled, a tiny orange meteor extinguished in the snow. The man's feet kicked once, twice, then went still. The second German fumbled for his rifle, a cry strangled in his throat. He never saw Markov. The Siberian rose from the snow itself, as if born from it. There was no knife fight, no dramatic struggle. One moment the German was turning, the next, Markov's hand was clamped over his mouth, yanking his head back, and a blade, dark and non-reflective, drew a single, precise line across the exposed throat. It was a butcher's cut, deep and final. A hot, crimson jet painted the pristine snow. A shocking, violent flower blooming in monochrome. The sound was a wet, sighing gurgle, quickly swallowed by the hungry silence. Sasha watched, paralyzed. He saw the life leave the man's eyes, not with a dramatic flash, but with a dimming, like a lamp turned low. He saw the body convulse, then slump in Markov's arms. The efficiency of it was more terrifying than any rage. It was hygiene. In less than 20 seconds, it was over. The two black figures dragged the gray-green ones into a deep shadow between the ice walls. Kotov was already there. He went through their pockets with clinical detachment. A map case, a half-eaten ration bar, a photograph of a woman, now speckled with red. He took the map, ignored the rest. He nodded to Yevgeny, who used a bayonet to stab through the dead men's radio, smashing its delicate insides. Markov was already scuffing snow over the vivid blood stain, his movements quick, covering the evidence. Kotov looked up from the bodies, his soot-blackened face finding Sasha's position. His eyes held no triumph, no remorse. They were the eyes of a mechanic who had removed two faulty parts. He gave a single, slow nod. The lesson was imparted. This was the work. This was the seepage. This was the corruption of the enemy's certainty. The black constellation reformed. They moved on, leaving the ice cavern slightly less pure. The wind picked up, whistling through the new-made graves, beginning the long work of burying the truth under drifting snow. But ahead the fortress loomed larger now, its details hardening in the deepening twilight. It was no longer a distant shape. It was a destination, and the silence that had just been broken now felt heavier, charged with the promise of more violence to come. The ice had been baptized. The shadow was inside the gate. The island did not rise from the ice. It erupted. What had been a distant silhouette now filled the world, a sheer wall of scarred granite and weeping black ice. The frozen sea had clawed at its base for millennia, leaving a skirt of shattered boulders and treacherous, wind-sculpted snowdrifts. The air here was different, colder, stiller, and laced with the faint, metallic scent of coal smoke and machinery oil. The fortress breathed. It was a low, subsonic hum felt in the teeth and the hollow of the chest, the vibration of generators deep within its stone heart. Kotov pressed his back against the freezing rock, the black wool of his bushlat merging with the dark stone. The men were motionless behind him, scattered like coal chips in the deep shadows of the boulder field. Above, the sheer face was punctuated by the blind, dark eyes of embrasures. No movement, no sentries on the outer walls, the arrogance of concrete and steel. They believed the ice and the machine guns were their guards. But Batya was not looking up. He was looking down at the sketch in his mind, overlaid onto the brutal reality before him. The sewage outflow. According to the defector's trembling testimony and the pre-war blueprints, it was here, on the eastern lee, where the island's own bulk shielded it from the worst of the wind and the observer's eyes. It was a vulnerability born of imperial engineering, a practicality forgotten in the conversion to a fortress. He found it not by sight but by smell, a faint, sour, organic tang, almost frozen out of existence, but present beneath the oil and frost. He followed it, moving low along the rock face, his gloved fingers tracing the stone. Then he saw it, a darker patch in the shadow, an arch of rusted iron set into the rock, half obscured by a cascading curtain of ice. The grate. Beyond it, utter blackness. It was smaller than he had feared. The defector had been wrong or had lied to seem more valuable. The opening was not a meter wide. It was perhaps 70 centimeters, a tight, vertical oval. A birth canal into stone, and it was not merely barred by a grate. The iron lattice was thick with decades of rust, and behind it, a solid opaque wall of ice, a frozen plug of effluent and seawater that filled the tunnel for who knew how far. A wave of pure physical revulsion hit Kotov, so potent it was a taste in his mouth, not from the filth, from the memory it triggered. It did not come as a full flashback, but as a sensory assault. The smell, the same choking, sweet rot stench of confined salt and human waste. The roar not of wind, but of surging black water in a pipe somewhere south, in another life. The cold bite of an iron grate against his cheek as he watched, helpless, fingers clawing through the bars, as the boy, young, so young his eyes not yet hardened, was ripped from his grip by the violent flush. The last bubbles from his mouth, the final widening stare swallowed by the dark. Kotov blinked, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle in his scarred cheek twitched. The frozen present snapped back. This was not that pipe. This was frozen. This was solid. This was a door. He had failed then. He would not fail now. The debt was here, waiting to be repaid. He gestured. Markov and Yevgeny slithered forward. Markov examined the grate, his fingers lightly brushing the rusted joints. He nodded. It was old, brittle. Yevgeny unstrapped the bolt cutters from Sasha's back. The massive tools looked like dinosaur bones in his hands. He positioned the jaws over the thickest lower bar, where rust had done its work. This was the moment, the first irrevocable step. Once the grate was breached, there was no going back. The ice would carry the sound. Kotov looked at each man in turn. He held up a closed fist, then slowly opened it, palm down, pressing it toward the ground. Absolute silence. The weight of the world rests here. Yevgeny took a deep, silent breath, his massive shoulders bunching. He applied pressure. The sound was not a sharp crack. It was a deep, agonized groan, a protest of fatigued metal that seemed to echo up the rock face. Every man froze, hearts suspended. They looked up, expecting a cry, a flashlight beam, the coughing start of a machine gun. Nothing. Only the wind's perpetual whistle over the battlements far above. The fortress slept on, arrogant in its slumber. The bar gave way with a final muted snap. Yevgeny worked methodically, cutting 3 more bars, creating a jagged black hole just large enough for a man to squeeze through on his belly. The opened maw exhaled a colder, fouler breath. Now, the ice plug. Kotov took the entrenching tool from his own pack. He did not swing it. He began to scrape. The ice was not clean. It was layered, filth-ridden, a geological record of the fortress's waste. He worked with a terrible focused patience, handing back frozen chunks to be silently dispersed in the shadows. Markov relieved him, then Yevgeny. The work was glacial, nerve-shredding. Each scrape was a potential alarm. Sasha watched the cliffs above, his glasses turning between the dark openings and his comrades. His world shrunk to the pounding of his own blood in his ears. After an hour of excruciating labor, the tunnel was revealed. It was a tube of slimy curved brick, descending at a slight angle into perfect darkness. The stench was palpable now, a physical presence. At its edge, the ice gave way to a shallow, frozen stream of unspeakable matter. Kotov did not hesitate. He unslung his PPSH, holding it above his chest. He looked back once, not at the men, but past them, at the frozen gulf they had crossed, at the distant shore that was no longer home. There was no courage in his face, only a final grim acceptance. He was the toxin. This was the vein. He dropped onto his belly and slithered into the black hole. The frozen filth crackled under his weight. The tight walls pressed in on the wool of his bushlat. The darkness swallowed him whole. One by one, the black shapes followed, disappearing into the gut of the fortress. The last man, Sasha, took one more terrified glance at the open sky, now a narrow strip of indigo above the rock. Then he too entered the gullet, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. Behind them, the jagged hole in the grate stared out at the empty ice, a silent wound in the stone. The wind swept snow, beginning to veil the tracks, the scattered ice chips, the evidence of the poison's entry. Inside, the world became touch and smell and sound. The sound of their own ragged breathing, the crunch and slide of their bodies, the occasional horrifying drip of thawing waste from the brick ceiling onto their backs. They were in the bowel of the beast, and they were crawling toward its heart. The darkness inside the pipe was absolute. It was a thick, liquid blackness that pressed against Kotov's eyes, a weight on the chest. The only world was the universe of sensation beneath him, the frozen, gritty slurry of effluent that cracked and gave way to a clinging, semi-frozen muck, the slimy, curved brick walls that snagged the coarse wool of his bushlat with every inch gained. The stench was no longer a smell, It was a taste coating the tongue and throat, a miasma of ammonia, decay, and chemical waste that made each breath a calculated risk of gagging. He moved by feel and by memory of the schematic, a blind larva in a stone intestine. The descent was shallow but relentless. The cold of the rock seeped through the layers of wool and flesh, a different cold than the open ice, a damp, penetrating chill that promised rheumatism and oblivion. Behind him, he could hear the others, the wet, rhythmic slide of bodies, the occasional stifled grunt as a knee found a sharp piece of frozen debris, the metallic whisper of a weapon being carefully adjusted. No one spoke. The pipe was a confessional that only accepted the sounds of sin. Then, a new sound. Faint at first, a distant, mechanical grumble felt more through the brick than heard. The heartbeat of the fortress. Generators. Then voices. Muffled, distorted by turns and layers of stone, but unmistakably human. German. They were not shouts or alerts. They were the bored, conversational tones of men in a guard room. The faint clink of a cup on a saucer. The sheer, terrifying normalcy of it was a shock. They were inches, feet, away from a world of light and warmth and coffee, separated only by a wall of brick and belief. Kotov froze. His hand, slick with filth, came up in a clenched fist. The procession behind him halted. In the sudden stillness, the sounds clarified. A laugh, a complaint about the cold, the sizzle of something on a stove. It was this last sound, this domestic mundane detail, that ignited a cold fury in Kotov's gut. These men were warm. They were fed. They believed themselves secure in their steel and concrete womb. They had murdered his scout on the ice with the casual indifference of swatting a fly. The memory of the boy in the southern pipe tried to surface, the terror, the helplessness. But Kotov forced it down. That was grief. This was now. This was the work. The corrosion had to be silent, invisible. He moved forward again, even slower, each movement a conscious act of stealth. The pipe began to level out. His gloved hand, probing ahead, felt a change. The brick gave way to cold, standing water. The frozen crust had ended. They were now in a sump, a shallow pool of liquid waste. The cold was knife-sharp, instantly soaking through his boots and the knees of his trousers. A faint, gray light bled from ahead. Not daylight, but the sickly yellow glow of an electric bulb, reflected off wet stone. The pipe ended in a wider chamber, a catch basin. Above, a heavy iron grate, the final barrier between the sewer and the fortress basement levels. Kotov reached the edge of the light. He lay perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust. The grate was above him, about 2 meters up a slimy wall. The light came from a bare bulb in a wire cage, hanging in a vaulted brick passageway beyond the grate. He could see boots walking past. German jackboots, polished, their rhythmic tread echoing. A supply detail, carrying crates. They passed without a glance downward. The grate was just part of the floor to them, a forgotten detail. This was the nexus, the point of entry, the moment the shadow had to solidify. He waited for the footsteps to fade. Then, with agonizing slowness, he rose from the foul water, his body a cascade of dark, dripping filth. He pressed himself against the wet brick beneath the grate, listening. Only the drip of water and the distant grumble. He gestured. Yevgeny moved forward, the massive bolt cutters once again in hand. But this was different. The grate here was newer, stronger. Cutting would be loud, protracted. Impossible. Kotov shook his head. He pointed to the edges of the grate. It was set into a frame, secured by large, slotted bolts. From his pack, Kotov drew a long, flat metal tool, a rusted, modified wrench taken from a German depot months ago. He fitted it over the first bolt head. This was not about strength, but about absolute, silent control. He leaned his weight into it, his muscles corded, his breath held. The bolt, seized by rust and time, resisted. A tendon stood out in his neck. A low, almost inaudible groan escaped his clenched teeth, a sound of pure strain. With a shudder that traveled up the tool and into his bones, the bolt began to turn. The sound was a deep, gritty shriek of metal on metal, hideously loud in the chamber. Kotov froze, his eyes locked on the passageway above. A bootstep stopped. A voice, curious, called out, "Was Wardas?" What was that? Kotov's world narrowed to the patch of illuminated floor beyond the grate. A shadow lengthened. A German soldier, a young Gefreiter, leaned over, peering down into the gloom, his hand on the holster at his belt. His face was bored, squinting. He looked directly at Kotov. For a timeless second, their eyes met through the iron lattice. The German's expression shifted from boredom to confusion, then to the dawning horror of recognizing a human face, blackened and savage, staring back from the filth below his feet. His mouth opened to sound the alarm. He never got the chance. From the darkness beside Kotov, Markov moved. He didn't climb. He flowed up the wall with a terrifying simian grace, using minute imperfections in the brick. As the German inhaled to shout, Markov's arm shot through the grate. Not with a knife. His hand, clad in black leather, clamped over the soldier's mouth and nose with brutal force, yanking his head forward, smashing his face against the iron bars with a sickening crunch of cartilage and bone. The sound was a wet, choked-off gasp. The German's eyes bulged, wide with shock and agony. His hands flailed, scrabbling at Markov's vice-like grip. Kotov was already moving. He jammed the wrench into the next bolt. Yevgeny's hands joined his. The second bolt turned faster. The third. Above, the German's struggles weakened. A final feeble kick against the floor. Then he went limp, held upright only by Markov's unrelenting arm through the grate. A thin trickle of blood and other matter dripped down onto Kotov's shoulder. The last bolt came free. Kotov and Yevgeny lifted the heavy grate, sliding it aside with a scrape of iron on stone that was masked by the generator's hum. Markov lowered the dead soldier silently to the floor of the passageway. One by one, the black, dripping figures emerged from the cesspool into the harsh electric light of the enemy's house. They stood in a spreading puddle of foul water, their bushlats steaming slightly in the warmer air, the stench of the pipe rising from them like a plague mist. They were no longer shadows on the ice. They were a cancer in the bloodstream. Kotov looked down at the dead Gefreiter, his face a ruined mask against the dirty floor. No pity, just a calculation. The alarm was unsounded, but the clock was now screaming. The first cell of the fortress body was infected. He pointed down the passageway, then to his eyes, then made a closing motion with his fist. The world had shrunk again, from the vastness of the frozen gulf to the confines of these brick corridors. The hunt in the dark had begun. The corrosion was spreading. The corridor was a gullet of yellow brick and shivering electric light. The air was warm, thick with the smells of damp wool, cooked food, and machine oil. A sickening contrast to the pure, killing cold outside. It was the smell of the enemy's habitation, and it felt more alien, more violating than the frozen waste of the pipe. The black-clad figures stood for a moment, dripping their foul baptismal water onto the concrete floor, their shadows monstrous and elongated on the walls. They were inside the clock. Now they had to break its gears before it chimed. Kotov's mind, cold and sharp as the ice outside, partitioned the fortress. The schematic was a ghost map overlaid on his senses. The generator hum was a directional beacon, deeper, to the right. That was the muscle, the power. Straight ahead, the smell of food and the distant, tinny scratch of a radio. The barracks, the living quarters, the heart and the gut. Their poison had to flow both ways simultaneously, paralyzing the body before it could feel the infection. He split the men with silent, precise gestures. 4 with Yevgeny, the stoker, for the generator and the communications room marked near it. A brute force task: cut the power, cut the voice. The rest, with him and Markov, would move towards the living areas. A surgeon's task: silent, intimate, terminal. They left the dead sentry in his own shadow, a slumped, gray form at the edge of the pool of filth. The two groups melted in opposite directions, their soaked bushlats leaving dark, shrinking trails on the stone. Kotov's group moved like a single, multi-limbed organism. Markov was the antenna, gliding ahead, pausing at each corner, his head tilted, listening for the rhythm of patrolling boots, the cadence of conversation. Sasha was the trailing sense, constantly looking back, his wired glasses catching the ghastly light, terrified of something following them from the dark pipe. Kotov was the brain, the decision point. They passed doorways labeled with German Gothic script: Vorratskammer, storeroom, Werkzeug, tools, Unteroffiziersmesse, NCO's mess. Each was a potential ambush, a pocket of life. Kotov ignored them. They were heading for the source of the radio sound, the congregated life. Then, a sound that froze their blood. Not boots, not voices, whistling. A cheerful, off-key tune, Lily Marlene, coming from around the next corner, growing louder, approaching. There was no alcove, no door to hide in. The corridor was a straight, bright tube. In 3 seconds, the whistler would be upon them. Kotov did not panic. He pressed himself flat against the wall just before the corner, becoming a part of the shadow there. He looked at Markov and made a swift, horizontal cutting motion across his own throat, then pointed to the floor directly in front of him. He looked at the man behind him, a seasoned sailor with a face like old rope, and pointed to the opposite wall. They understood. The whistling grew louder, carefree. A German soldier, a cook by the stains on his apron, rounded the corner, carrying an empty metal tureen. He was looking down, shuffling his feet, lost in the melancholy of the song. He took 2 steps into their midst before he sensed the presence, the sudden absence of empty space. His head came up. The whistling died in his throat. His eyes, wide and blue, swept over the nightmare tableau. Black, dripping, inhuman figures pressed against the walls on either side of him, their faces smeared with grotesque war paint of soot and sewage, their eyes glittering with a light that had nothing to do with the electric bulbs. For a moment, there was only the hum of the generator and the man's ragged, indrawn breath of pure, uncomprehending terror. He opened his mouth. He never made a sound. Markov, from his left, moved like a sprung trap. One hand clamped over the man's mouth, crushing the cry back into his lungs. The other drove a short, heavy naval dagger up and under the rib cage, seeking the heart. It was not a stab. It was a deep, precise insertion. At the same instant, The sailor from the opposite wall lunged, grabbing the man's thrashing legs, pinning them. The cook convulsed, a terrible shuddering jolt that rattled the tureen in his hands. A muffled, wet groan escaped Markov's leather-clad palm. His eyes, locked on Kotov's, bulged with the profound shock of his own extinguishing. The cheerful tune was gone, replaced by the horrible wet sucking sound of the blade being withdrawn. The body sagged, heavy and sudden. They lowered him to the floor, a bundle of stained apron, and sudden stillness. The tureen clattered slightly, a ringing note that echoed down the corridor. They froze again, listening. Had the generator's hum covered it? From a doorway 20 meters ahead, a voice called out, annoyed. Wilhelm, was machst du? Bring den Topf zur Ach. Wilhelm, what are you doing? Bring the pot back. A door began to open, light spilling out. Kotov's mind calculated in fractions of a second. The voice was close. The body was at their feet. The evidence was damning. They were at the threshold of discovery. He made a decision. Not a retreat, but an acceleration. He pointed at the opening door, then made a furious, sweeping gesture forward. The time for stealth was collapsing. The clockwork had jammed. Now was the time for the controlled detonation of terror. He stepped over the dead cook, not looking down, his PPSH coming up to his hip, his fingers sliding into the trigger guard. The black organism, its cover irrevocably blown, coalesced and flowed toward the spreading wedge of light, no longer a seeping poison, but a scalpel, aiming for the nerve cluster. The whistling had stopped. In its place was a new sound, the soft, collective, deadly intake of breath from men who were about to become the very incarnation of the enemy's darkest whispers. The Schwarzer Todd was no longer a legend in the trenches. It was here, in the hallway, smelling of the grave and coming for the living. The door swung open fully, revealing a warm, smoky haze, and the bulk of a German Feldwebel in shirt sleeves, his suspenders dangling. He held a ladle. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated annoyance, ready to berate the hapless Wilhelm for his clumsiness. What he saw was not Wilhelm. He saw a wall of black, reeking darkness that seemed to suck the light from the room behind him. He saw faces that were not human, grotesque masks of soot, grease, and other unspeakable substances, etched with scars and pits of shadow. He saw the dull, oily gleam of weapons held not at port arms, but in the low, ready position of men who lived in the intimate economy of killing. For a millisecond, his brain rejected the input. It was impossible. A hallucination born of boredom and bad schnapps. Then Kotov fired. The sound of the PPSH-41 in the confined brick corridor was not a gunshot. It was a catastrophic ripping roar, a sustained detonation of sheet metal that obliterated all other sound. The muzzle flash was a stuttering, blinding sun that painted the scene in stark, stroboscopic nightmares. The Feldwebel's torso disintegrating into a cloud of red mist and shredded fabric, his body hurled back into the room as if hooked to a wire. The splintering of the doorframe, chips of brick exploding from the walls. The roar was the trigger. The carefully partitioned plan dissolved into a single unifying imperative: chaos and death. Kotov crossed the threshold into hell. The room was a combination mess and barracks alcove. A dozen German soldiers, caught in the suspended animation of off-duty life, playing cards, writing letters, mending socks, were frozen in tableau. The radio still played a faint waltz. The air, a second before thick with tobacco smoke and idle talk, was now filled with flying splinters, powdered plaster, and the copper tang of blood. Time did not slow down. It fractured. Kotov's world became a series of hyper-focused, disconnected impressions. His PPSH traversed left to right on its strap, his finger holding the trigger in a long, controlled burst. The weapon juddered against his hip, spent shells cascading in a brassy fountain. He saw a young soldier rising from a bunk, his mouth a perfect O of surprise, his chest suddenly a Jackson Pollock of crimson. He saw a card table erupt, paper and cards and splinters mingling with the things that had been sitting behind it. To his left, Markov had become a silent, spinning vortex of blade and gun stock. He didn't fire his weapon. He used it as a bludgeon, smashing the butt into a temple with a wet crack, then reversing it to drive the bayonet lug into a throat. His free hand held his dagger, which found kidneys, arteries, the soft space under a chin. He moved through the chaos with the eerie, efficient grace of a man harvesting wheat. Sasha was on the floor. He hadn't chosen to be. He'd been knocked down by the concussive blast of the doorframe's destruction. This saved his life. A burst of return fire from a corner where two Germans had grabbed their rifles stitched a line of holes in the wall where his head had been. Sasha lay in the wreckage, screaming. But no sound came out. The gunfire had deafened him. He saw the boot of a German soldier stumbling back, about to crush his hand. Instinct, not courage, took over. He fumbled with the PPSH he'd been given, his hands slippery with other men's blood. He didn't aim. He pointed the muzzle at the man's legs and squeezed. The weapon, lighter, with a higher rate of fire than Kotov's, screamed in his hands. The German dancer a horrible, jerking jig and collapsed. A grenade, tossed from the hallway by one of Kotov's men, arced into the room, clattering on the stone floor near the stove. The sight of that knobbly green-gray lemon triggered a primal panic. Germans scrambled, dove, screamed. Kotov turned his face away, pulling his bushlat over his head. The blast was a physical fist. It compressed the air, sucked it back, then expelled it in a hurricane of shrapnel, wood, and shattered crockery. The radio's music died with a pop. The lights flickered violently. When the smoke cleared, the room was a charnel house. The living were now few, and they were no longer soldiers. They were wounded, terrified animals, bleeding from 100 tiny cuts, their eardrums ruptured, their minds broken by the sudden, intimate apocalypse. This was the core of the terror. It was not the killing. It was the method. The black figures moved through the carnage they had created, not with berserker rage, but with a chilling, procedural calm. They stepped over the writhing, the dying. They checked corners. They put a single, precise round into any form that still showed signs of coordinated movement. It was mopping up. It was sanitation. Kotov's ears rang with a high-pitched whine. He blinked through the smoke, his eyes stinging. He saw Markov finish a wounded man with a knife thrust to the base of the skull. He saw Yevgeny's group spill into the room from the far corridor, their faces spattered with fresh, different grime, oil and carbon. The stoker gave a sharp nod. The generators were down. The communications were dead. The fortress was blind and mute. But the clock was still ticking. The gunfire and the grenade were an alarm no wire could carry. Kotov grabbed Sasha by the collar of his bushlat, hauling him to his feet. The boy's glasses were cracked, one lens a spiderweb. He was trembling violently, his eyes unfocused. Kotov slapped him, not with malice, but with the clinical force needed to restart a stalled engine. Sasha's eyes snapped to his. Kotov pointed to his own ears, then shook his head. He pointed at Sasha, then at the doorway they'd entered, making a guarding motion. Sasha, understanding through the haze of terror, nodded dumbly, his weapon clutched to his chest like a talisman. The harvest was over. The room was a monument to their work. But the fortress was a body, and a body reacts to a localized infection. The pounding of boots now echoed from the stone stairwell at the end of the hall. Shouted orders, confused but gathering coherence. The garrison was rousing. Kotov looked at his men, their black coats now dusted with plaster, soaked with blood both alien and their own. They were no longer a poison. They were a wound in the side of the fortress, and the white blood cells were mustering. The next phase was not about stealth or terror or even harvesting. It was about survival against the coming fever. They had sown the wind. Now they had to weather the storm. The ringing in Kotov's ears was a universe of white noise, a seashell roar drowning the distant shouts, the thudding boots, the moans of the dying behind them. But he didn't need to hear. He could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots, the organized, gathering thunder of reaction. The fortress, wounded, was now clenching its fist. The corridor ahead was a gauntlet. The yellow bulb light was gone, replaced by the frantic, dancing beams of German flashlights slicing the smoke from intersecting passages. Shadows of men, distorted and huge, flickered on the walls. The alarm, unsounded by wire, was now screaming through the stone in the language of movement and panic. Yevgeny's group had brought the news with them. The generator room was a tomb of sparking wreckage and dead men. The communications center was a charred ruin from a satchel charge. But the cost was etched on them. One man missing, left behind in a twisted metal stairwell, another clutching a seeping red stain on his thigh, his face pale as wax. They were no longer a full toxin. They were a bleeding wound. Kotov processed this with a cold, swift logic. They could not go back. The pipe was a death trap now, likely already discovered. They could not hold this charnel house of a mess room. They were insects in a stone hive, and the swarm was stirring. His scarred mind, the one that remembered the boy in the southern pipe, that had calculated the creep across the ice, now performed its final, most brutal calculation. The fortress had a brain, not the radio, but the command post, the commandantur, marked on the schematic as a reinforced central bunker deep in the rock. If the body was reacting, sever the brain, collapse the will, create a vacuum of orders where only panic could grow. He pointed down the main corridor, toward the heart of the thunder, then made a hammering motion against his own palm. We go to them. We go to the source. It was not a tactic of stealth or terror. It was a tactic of sheer, suicidal momentum, a direct injection into the heart. They moved, not as shadows now, but as a black avalanche. Markov was the point, a wraith consuming distance. Kotov was the core, a grim engine. Yevgeny and the wounded were the grinding, determined rear. Sasha, shoved into the middle of the pack, was carried along like debris in a flood. They met the first organized resistance at a T-junction. A squad of Germans, helmeted, rifles ready, was forming a skirmish line, an NCO barking orders to fix bayonets. They saw the black wave rounding the corner. For a second, there was a standoff, measured in heartbeats. The Germans saw not soldiers, but apparitions from a collective nightmare. figures carved from soot and blood, their eyes reflecting the flashlight beams like animals in a forest. Markov didn't break stride. He raised his weapon and fired a short, cutting burst that felled the NCO mid-shout. Then the avalanche hit the line. This was not the chaotic harvest of the barracks. This was the meat grinder, a desperate, close-quarters slaughter where geometry and luck meant more than skill. The corridor became a deafening, flashing tunnel of death. The staccato barks of German Mausers, the sustained, ripping roars of the Soviet submachine guns, the screams of hitmen, the clash of steel on steel. Kotov fought with a terrifying, economized fury. He used his PPSH like a fire hose, sweeping a burst across two Germans trying to take cover behind a supply cart. He felt a round tug at the thick wool of his bushlad over his ribs, a hot kiss of lead that left a bruise for the ages. He didn't flinch. He dropped the empty drum magazine, slammed in a fresh one from his chest in a motion practiced 10,000 times, and kept moving. Yevgeny, his strength monumental, used the stock of his weapon as a club, clearing a path through the melee, his wounded comrade leaning on him, firing one-handed over his shoulder. A German lunged with a bayonet. Yevgeny batted the rifle aside, grabbed the man by the helmet strap, and smashed his head into the brick wall with a sound like a dropped melon. But the avalanche was slowing, shedding pieces. The man with the thigh wound gasped, sat down hard against the wall, and did not get up. Another, a silent sailor who had cut the grate, took a round in the neck and fell, a dark fountain arcing onto the stones. They broke through the German line, leaving a tangle of bodies and writhing wounded in their wake. But the cost was written in the suddenly lighter feel of their formation, in the new limps, the fresh blood mingling with the old on their black coats. Ahead was a heavy, riveted steel door, slightly ajar. Light and the sound of frantic, raised voices spilled from it. The command post. The brain. Kotov didn't order an assault. He simply did not stop. He hit the door at a run, his shoulder slamming it open. Inside was a scene of organized chaos becoming unraveled. Maps on tables, a large situation board, field telephones now silent and dead. A major, his face flushed with anger and fear, was yelling at two junior officers. Several radio operators sat uselessly at their dead sets. A handful of senior NCOs turned, weapons rising. Kotov took it all in with a single sweeping glance. He didn't fire at the men. He fired at the map table, at the situation board, at the bank of useless telephones. Sparks flew, paper erupted. The major ducked behind a heavy desk. This was the final corrosion, not of flesh, but of command, of certainty. Markov and the remaining others poured in after him, fanning out. A short, vicious firefight erupted in the confined space, a storm of deafening noise and ricochets. A German officer fired a Luger wildly, the bullet shattering the glass face of a large chronometer on the wall. Glass rained down. Kotov, moving behind filing cabinets for cover, saw the major peer out from behind the desk, aiming a pistol not at him, but at Sasha, who was frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed. The boy was a clear target. Time did not slow, but for Kotov, it distilled. The boy in the southern pipe. The face against the grating, eyes wide, fingers slipping. A failure etched in water and regret. The young scout on the ice, jerking under the machine gun fire. Another boy lost. Not this one. Kotov lunged, not with the grace of Markov, but with the brute, desperate momentum of a man intercepting fate. He didn't shoot. He threw his body. The major's pistol cracked. Kotov felt a searing, white-hot impact in his side, just below his ribcage. It wasn't like the tug of the earlier round. This was a punch from a red-hot iron, driving the air from his lungs. His charge became a collapsing stumble. He crashed into Sasha, sending them both sprawling to the floor just as Markov cut the major down with a burst that chewed across the fine wood of the desk. The firefight sputtered and died. The last resistance in the room was eliminated. The sudden silence was a physical presence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the living and the drip of the shattered chronometer's mechanism. Kotov lay on the cold floor, the warmth of his own blood spreading beneath him, a shocking heat against the chill of the stone. He looked up at the broken clock. The hands were stopped. He had done it. He had stopped the clock of the fortress. Sasha crawled to him, his cracked glasses askew, his hands fluttering uselessly over the dark, wet stain blooming through the black wool of Kotov's bushlat. Kotov looked at him, at the boy's unscathed face. He saw not Sasha, but the other boy, from the pipe, from the ice. And this time, he saw the eyes not wide with terror, but alive. He had paid the debt. The calculation was complete. He tried to speak, to give an order, but only a wet, bubbling gasp came out. He pointed a bloody, trembling finger toward the door, toward the way they had come, then toward the sky beyond the stone. Out. Get them out. Then his hand fell to the floor, and his world narrowed to the sight of the broken clock, its hands forever frozen, and the feeling of the ice finally, mercifully, reaching his core. The silence in the command post was not empty. It was heavy, layered like sediment. It was the silence of dead radios, of extinguished voices, of spent gunpowder settling onto maps stained with coffee, and now, with darker, more permanent fluids. The brain of Fort Mallet had ceased its electrical hum. All that remained was the drip of the shattered chronometer, a dying heartbeat, marking the passage of a world that no longer existed. Markov stood over Kotov's body for a span of 3 breaths, his own chest heaving. He saw the stillness, the final release of tension in the scarred face, the fixed gaze on the broken clock. No grief showed on the Siberian's soot-blackened features. Grief was a luxury for the living, and they were not yet assured of that status. He simply knelt, placed 2 fingers against Kotov's throat to confirm what he already knew, and then closed the old man's eyes with a touch that was, for him, strangely gentle. He rose. The mantle of command did not pass with words. It passed with a look, a straightening of the spine. Markov's hunter's eyes swept the room. Yevgeny leaned against a map table, his massive frame trembling with exhaustion, one arm cradling the other where a bullet had gouged a furrow through muscle. Of the 24 black shadows that had flowed onto the ice, fewer than 10 remained upright. They were haggard, their bushlats torn, scorched, soaked through with a spectrum of filth, sewage, oil, German blood, their own blood. They were no longer an instrument. They were the battered, shattered remains of one. But the fortress was not dead. A body can twitch for a long time after the brain is gone. From the depths of the stone labyrinth, they could hear it. Distant, confused shouts. The sporadic, nervous clatter of a lone machine gun firing at shadows. The thud of grenades, German stick grenades. The sound distinct and hollow, as pockets of leaderless soldiers tried to clear corridors of phantoms. The organism was in its death throes, but its limbs could still kill. Markov moved to the heavy steel door and pushed it shut. The sound was a dull, final boom. He dragged the body of the German major and piled it with others against the metal, a barricade of the dead. It would not hold long, but it would grant minutes. He turned to the survivors. His gestures were slow, deliberate, meant to pierce the fog of shock and deafness. He pointed to the large situation map on the wall. He jabbed a finger at their position, a red pin in the central bunker. Then his finger traced a route not back the way they came. That was a roaring throat of enemy reaction now. But upward, through secondary passages marked as ventilation access and utility conduits. The schematic was in Kotov's mind, but Markov had memorized its veins and arteries. The fortress had a roof, observation posts, and beyond that, the sky. Yevgeny understood first. He nodded, pushing himself off the table with a grimace. He began rifling through the German supply crates stacked in a corner. He found what he needed: stick grenades, steel hand granite, their long wooden handles like deadly bouquets. He passed them out, 2 per man. Last resort tools for clearing tight spaces. Sasha still knelt by Kotov, his hands resting on the old man's chest, as if trying to feel a heartbeat he knew was absent. Markov walked over, not with pity, but with imperative. He grabbed Sasha by the shoulder and pulled him to his feet. He pointed to Kotov, then to his own eyes, then to Sasha, and finally to the ceiling. The message was brutal, ancestral. He saw for you. Now you see for us. He thrust a German flashlight into Sasha's shaking hand. The student was now the pathfinder. They moved out through a rear hatch in the command post, a narrow access way for wiring and pipes. The world compressed again, from the relative expanse of the command center to a claustrophobic crawl space of dripping condensation and humming, inactive cables. They were in the arteries of the beast, climbing through its dead husk. The sounds of the dying fortress were muffled here, replaced by the sounds of their own suffering. The labored wet breathing of the wounded, the scrape of weapons and bodies against cold metal ducts, the occasional stifled groan of pain. They moved like ghosts through the walls of their own nightmare. Sasha led, the beam of his flashlight a trembling, frail probe in the absolute dark. He read German labels, matched them to the ghost map in his memory, now guided by the cold, silent pressure of Markov's hand on his boot when he hesitated at a junction. The climb was vertical, punishing. Each rung of an iron ladder sent jolts of agony through Yevgeny's wounded arm. A man below him slipped, his strength gone, and fell into the darkness with only a short, surprised grunt. No one could go back for him. The climb was a filter, separating the barely living from the soon-to-be dead. After an eternity of climbing, Sasha's light found a hatch marked Luftschachtzugang, nicht öffnen by alarm, ventilation shaft access, do not open during alarm. He looked back at Markov, a silent question in his cracked lens eyes. Markov's answer was to unsling his weapon and nod. Sasha threw the bolt, shoved the hatch open, and rolled out into blinding, painful, glorious cold. The roof of the fortress was a shattered landscape of ice-rimed concrete, ventilator cowlings, and the skeletal remains of shot-up anti-aircraft mounts. The wind here was a cleansing fury, scouring away the stench of blood and cordite, replacing it with the sterile, sharp smell of the frozen sea. The sky was not yet light, but the black had softened to a deep, bruised indigo in the east. Dawn was a rumor on the horizon. They were not alone. At the far end of the roof, a lone German machine gun nest cut off and forgotten in the chaos below, swiveled at the sound of the hatch. Two helmeted figures, their faces pale smudges in the gloom, fumbled with their MG-42. There was no cover, no time for tactics. Yevgeny acted. He did not fire. He roared, a raw, animal sound torn from the depths of his furnace-tender's lungs, and charged. He was a massive, black, stumbling bull, one arm hanging useless, the other holding a stick grenade, its pin already pulled. The Germans stared, transfixed by the apparition. The gunner swung the MG-42 towards him, too slow. Yevgeny reached the sandbagged emplacement and threw himself over the top. The grenade, clutched to his chest, disappeared with him into the nest. The explosion was a muffled crump, followed by a sudden silencing gust of smoke and debris. No one moved. The wind whistled over the empty nest. Markov did not pause to mourn. He pushed the others forward toward the eastern parapet. Below them, the frozen gulf stretched, a vast pale plain, and on the horizon, where the indigo was thinning to gray, they saw them. Dark, tiny specks swarming across the ice like ants. The main Soviet assault. The big push. Right on schedule. The fortress was silent, its guns mute, its command dead. The door had been kicked open. Sasha stumbled to the parapet, his broken glasses lost somewhere in the climb. He looked back at the hatch, at the men around him, 4, maybe 5, including himself. He looked at Markov, who was staring east, his face a mask of hollow exhaustion. He looked down at his own hands, black with grime, sticky with Kotov's blood, now freezing in the wind. The black bushlats they wore were in tatters. The wool was shredded by shrapnel, burned by muzzle flashes, stiff with frozen blood of every origin. The color was no longer a uniform black. It was a tapestry of the night's work. Maroon, brown, iron oxide red, the pale gray of ash. The myth of the Schwarzer Tod had been made flesh, and the flesh was broken, bleeding, and utterly, devastatingly human. Markov raised a flare pistol they had taken from the command post. He pointed it at the lightning sky and pulled the trigger. The projectile shot upward with a hollow pop, a single brilliant red star bursting against the twilight, dripping embers onto the frozen roof below. A signal. The key is turned. As the red light died, the first true sliver of dawn cracked the horizon. A thin, razor-sharp line of gold. It illuminated the survivors on the roof, not as legends, but as men, small, battered, leaning against each other for support, their breath pluming in the new, cold light. It illuminated the frozen sea now teeming with the advancing tide of their army. And it illuminated Fort Mala beneath them, a silent, dark, conquered tooth of stone. The terror was over. The silence they had brought was now complete. All that remained was the wind, the coming light, and the long, slow wait for the living to reach them. The Black Death had come, done its work, and was now dissolving with the night, leaving behind only the color of dawn and the price, etched in frozen blood on torn wool.